Good morning, everybody. Sorry we're starting a couple of minutes late. I'd just like to start off the meeting welcoming everybody and to start with the first item on the agenda, which is to note the appointment of the chair today, which will be Councillor Blakeborough. So, Councillor Blakeborough, would you like to take over from here?
Thank you, everybody. I'm taking over from Simon Howarth. I've got, a tough act to follow, I think. Hopefully I will provide an environment so you've got challenging scrutiny, but always fostering relationships of trust and respect and kindness. Be kind to each other. The next on the agenda is to appoint a vice chair. Have we got a nomination for a vice chair?
Councillor Brown.
Councillor Woodhouse, could you do me a favour and just move your label towards that side? Brilliant. A little bit further up, that's fab. Great, thanks. There's many people in the room, and it would be good to do a round of introductions for the privilege of the masses out there watching in. So shall I start? Yes. So my name is Debbie Blakeborough and I'm chair of this committee.
My name is Councillor Louise Brown and I'm vice chair of this committee and also a member for Shire Newton Ward.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
I'm Ian Baker, Housing and Communities Manager.
I'm Kieran Durrant, Housing Options Manager, Job Share with
Sarah Ridley.
I'm Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Sarah Turvey-Barber, Strategic and Sustainable Living Manager.
Hugh Owen, Principal Environmental Health Officer.
Martin Grokert, I'm the elected member for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Councillor Roger Harris, Cresson Ward, Abergavenny and member of this committee.
Morning everyone, County Councillor Ruth Edwards, elected member for Lintilio Cresceni and also a member of the Adults Committee.
Morning, Sheila Woodhouse, member for Grovefield Ward in Abergavenny and member of this committee.
Jane Pratt, member for Llanelli, Clydach and Gilwen and member of this committee.
Paul Pavia, elected member for Larkfield and Chepstow and a member of this committee.
Val Smith, member for Lambeth Ward Observing.
And just to add, anybody who makes the effort to come to scrutiny, I'm always happy to ask questions. So Val, once the committee have asked their question, if there's any outstanding, I'm happy to take your questions. Apologies for absence. Richard?
No apologies received, Chair.
Okay. Declaration of interest as and when. People happy? Public open forum. I can't see any members of the public here, so move through from that. The next agenda item is on page 7, and that's to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. So this is just about confirming accuracy. Rather than going page by page, I'm sure you've all read them. Does anybody want to accept them? Move by Councillor Edwards and seconded by Councillor Harris. Brilliant, thanks. So going on to the main part of the agenda, we've got 3 reports here, all interlinked. Bed and breakfast, review of housing renewals policy and preventing homelessness update report. As I say, they're all interlinked, so many of our questions will probably overflow. But to go to the bed and breakfast policy first, I'm aware that this has come to us as a result of a recommendation from this committee. March, you made a recommendation for a policy because I think you were concerned about the use of bed and breakfast. What we need to do as a result of this is obviously to consider the report. and to ask questions, and then if we're happy enough for that recommendation to go to Cabinet. It'd probably be a good idea, Ian, if you could give an overview, background to this report and highlight anything in particular we need to be aware of, and then up to questions. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yes, you'll recall I brought a report to you in March which provided an operational overview of our use of bed and breakfast. This report, obviously linked, but this report creates a policy framework for our use of bed and breakfast. And to be honest, it's something that we've not really had in place before. So it's pulled together a number of regulatory requirements that were expected to follow essentially from Welsh Government. And obviously we've tried to reflect our practice in there. The policy itself doesn't introduce anything new, so it's merely put in writing what we do and our practice. A key dimension of the report is that it seeks to draw out our safeguarding responsibilities. So obviously part of today, are you as a committee reassured that we're operating as safely as we can be? Environmental health are part of that safeguarding process because they have a role in inspecting establishments. There's not really a great deal more I can say. It's beyond. It's a new framework within which that we operate, and obviously that's a basis for monitoring our delivery of that service. And again, I reiterate, our use of B&B continues to be a necessity. It's something that obviously we don't want to do. It's a last resort, but we continue to need that fallback position to ensure that we meet our statutory duties. But again, what I've tried to do is obviously draw out that we've got a number of actions running to try and mitigate that use.
Thanks, Ian. And welcome, Councillor Dimmick. No worries, you're here. That's brilliant. So open to questions now. Was your little lights not coming out? Oh, Councillor Craig.
Thank you, Chair. Could I first of all thank the officer for a very clear report. In fact, all of the three reports you mentioned, Chair. I wish all officer reports were as well laid out as this. It really sets things out for us in a very clear way, I think. So thank you very much to everyone concerned with writing these reports for us. Just a couple of very easy things, I would hope. Under the option appraisals, which is on page 14, it's point 4. Option 3 talks about schemes would not make provision for applicants assessed as unsuitable. I'm concerned that we're talking potentially here about some of the most vulnerable people, while also being the most difficult people to deal with. And clearly we will need some protocol there to protect officers as much as anything, and I completely can see that. But at the same time, do we then just turn our back on people and say, you're unsuitable, we're not going to do anything? I just want some reassurance, because part of me saying this is a very clear report is I think that's also reflected in the care that you show in your professional lives. But that may not always be the case. Successors to you might take a very different line, for example. I just want some assurance that when you as officers judge that someone is not suitable, they're not just cast to the four winds and potentially God knows what might happen. And then the second thing is that again, we're talking about potentially some of the more difficult and vulnerable people in our communities. It would be nice, I think, if we could have an annual report on provision under this B&B policy to be brought to this committee, just so we can monitor what's going on. Thanks.
So Ian, could you give... Oh,
I think I'm...
That's brilliant. So that's Karen.
Karen.
If you can give Councillor Crowfoot
Right, we
assurance.
certainly wouldn't turn our backs on anybody that we've got a duty to accommodate. The policy is aimed at providing the most suitable accommodation, taking into account any risks to other residents, whether in house share or B&B, and we would always try and place in house share for single applicants, but we do what is called a section 115 referral to the police before we place in B&B or house share, which comes back with any criminal offences, so that we can make a really informed decision on where is the best place to place them. And the more risky client would probably be placed in B&B, and a B&B that we know is suitable for them, and that we're aware of the circumstances of the other clientele in that B&B. We're quite open with the proprietors of the B&Bs without giving too much away. They are informed that there are risks. And an annual report? An annual report, yeah, we can certainly do that, no problem. And obviously, as soon as they go into, whether they're placed into house share or B&B, they're referred for urgent support. So whatever their needs are, there will be support in place whilst they are in B&B, and obviously our aim is to move them on to more suitable accommodation ASAP. Okay? All right, thank you.
Councillor Pratt, sorry, did you have your hand up earlier, Councillor Harris?
Yes.
All right, yep. So Councillor Harris, then Councillor Pratt, and then Councillor Edwards.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, to reiterate what Martin said about the clarity and excellence of the reports. You've been doing it a long time, Ian, and I've been listening a long time, and they up to the usual standard. So keep it up. Two things. Can you tell us a bit more about Night Stop? It's mentioned here. And secondly, we were in a process of acquiring a hostel type premises for the south of the county. Was that going to be given to us by the housing association, or were we buying it? And what's happening with the current negotiations? And thirdly, if they're getting sticky, are we in a position, and I'm sure we are, to talk to all the housing associations to see, because it's so important to make sure that people aren't left on the scrap heap anywhere, to come together and if necessary, if we can't individually afford a hostel, whether or not all the housing associations would come on board with us and share the cost.
Apologies, I can't remember your first question. Oh yeah, Night Stop. Yeah. Yeah, Night Stop it's a charity, so it's a brand, and it's a charity that uses hosts, so individual households who've got empty bedrooms, who are willing to take a young person as an alternative to rough sleeping, and it provides 2-3 nights accommodation, an opportunity to obviously washed and clean and fed, and it's something that we have investigated here as part of our trying to support improve our service for young people. We at this stage we're not looking to go down that route, and the reason being was because the model is quite narrow. So it's not rigid, but nevertheless, I think it would still have its limitations for Monmouthshire, albeit it's a very good service, and it's the type of service that I think would help plug a gap. But we're not looking to go down that route at this stage, and I say partly that was because of the costs involved, partly because of the nature of the model, and one of its limitations was only being for young people, whereas we have a need for all people of all ages. So what we've actually done, we're actually investigating a supported lodgings model with one of the local providers, and we're actually in the throes of developing something that will have a wider remit, and it will actually have a remit wider than homelessness as well. So it could be that somebody's not homeless but needs accommodation, and that might support the loneliness and isolation type model. So we're in the throes. I've actually got a meeting this afternoon about it. So we're working something up, which I say we think will have a wider remit, and that's something that we can share with the committee in due course. With regards to the hostel discussions, we particularly had a conversation with Monmouthshire Housing Association. Monmouthshire Housing Association have always been very supportive of us and working with us in terms of homelessness. They did identify a property. We did start negotiating on it, and it was a larger property. But unfortunately, they had a family come along at the 11th hour that desperately needed that accommodation. So we lost that. We lost that property. But that was the reason. And at the moment, we've not really progressed beyond that. Nothing else has been identified as such, albeit Monmouthshire Housing are open to buying something and have been actively looking on our behalf, but again, not been able to identify anything as yet. Karen and I have also had a conversation with them about surplus accommodation. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but there's accommodation that they're reviewing, and we've had a conversation about whether there's a role or scope to access that. That's not materialised into anything as yet, and obviously part of our issue is that we can't take on any liabilities. Equally, they don't want to create. So again, it's one of those tricky ones. We have asked the other housing associations as well, but nothing's come back as yet. But those dialogues will continue.
Councillor Harris, are you happy with the answer to that?
Yes, thanks, Ian. The only thing is, as you said, we can't take on liabilities, but if we can't, what happens at the at the bottom of the pile where somebody is homeless and we say, sorry, we run out of money.
Yeah, I mean it is a difficult one, but all the accommodation that we take on does need to be lettable. We haven't got the funding and resources to do extensive work to make it lettable. So one of the routines is Hugh or his colleagues will inspect properties prior to us taking them on. So again, there's an assessment there, and it's very much on a, it has pretty much got to be ready to go, or I say I think we're just potentially creating problems for ourselves.
Thanks, Ian. I'm aware we're slightly gone off topic, but I think that's good because it's all interlinked. And we were talking about young people, and I think that might lead nicely into Councillor Pratt's question, and others, but about young people. You've got a particular concern.
I was actually going to ask a couple of other things, but I'd like to also suggest something. I mean, what comes across very clearly to me when I meet any of the housing officers and people that deal with this issue, providing a roof over your head, the most basic need of any human being, is the care that the officers have. And I don't think we as councillors can really appreciate the pressure that you work under and the pressure to provide, and in very difficult circumstances when perhaps you need a bed for that night, and I would really welcome the opportunity to actually spend a day in the office with you, just to have a real appreciation of the challenges that you have. And although we can get a flavour of it in a meeting and from a report, I think that would be a really useful exercise. I am concerned about the youth provision that we have, because I'm fully aware that a lot of young people, it's in their teens when they actually, perhaps have a few arguments with their parents, or things don't go as they want them to go, and perhaps they get in with the wrong crowd, and how that's really impacting the fact that we haven't got we've had to trim back our youth provision. And the other thing that really concerns me, you've touched on checking the sort of police record and the criminal side of things. Remember that terrible case, and I know it's always the worst cases that get into the press, but the terrible case of the young lady that was murdered in a bed and breakfast accommodation in the Valleys, and lessons had to be learnt. I think it could have been in Torvine or Blaenau Gwent, I can't quite remember. I'm sure you remember the case. It was Caerphilly. And if somebody like that individual, who obviously had very complex mental health issues, but was placed in a situation where the public were put at risk, what would happen in that case? Would we be able to identify those mental health issues, and what are the risks around that, so that I can be absolutely confident that that would never happen in Monmouthshire? Thank you, Chair.
If I answer the last question first. Before we need to assess whether we've got a duty to accommodate somebody. So we are asking for proofs of their medication and who they're dealing with, i.e. are they with the mental health team, as we try to build up a bigger picture as we can of all their health, their criminal, so that we can make the right call as to where to put them. Plus they will have the support, and we're looking at the B&Bs we've got and seeing which one is appropriate. Obviously, if they're a high-risk offender, the police would be involved anyway. And, we do have times where they say, I'm sorry, B&B isn't suitable. And then where they need to start looking for accommodation, halfway houses or whatever they're, wherever they put them. But, there is the odd occasion where they're too high risk for us, and the police need to take over. But I think in that instance it was a young woman that got taken back to the room. We can't obviously monitor them 24/7. We are very clear that there are no guests, etc. To be taken into the rooms. They have to stay at the property, have to stay overnight and things like that. But I suppose we're never going to be 100% sure, if I'm completely honest. But we do as much as we can to make sure that the B&B or house share accommodation is the most appropriate for their needs. I mean, in house share we've got CCTV, not in all, but within a month or two it will be in all our properties. We have access to that, obviously only to look at any incidents that might have happened. We don't monitor it 24/7, but it is another form of security for vulnerable women, for example, for the house shares that are women only, etc. But we're in the process of having that done. With regards to young people and relationship breakdowns with parents and everything, Ruth Dare started with us at the beginning of January. She's our young person accommodation officer. She's just completed a full-on mediation course, and she has had amazing results since she started. She's a teacher, she's an ex-teacher, but wanted to do more with young people, and the results, getting them into training, getting them to stay at home, looking at work, benefits, the whole package. Her success rate is amazing. So hopefully that will reassure you that the young people are being encouraged to stay at home and having a bit of a reality check, as well, because they reach 17, 18, they want their little flat, etc., and unfortunately they're not there. Was there a third one?
Can I come back, Chair? Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I had the pleasure to meet Ruth, as you're aware, and obviously she's doing a brilliant job. On the week that I met her, she was actually looking to place a young person, and it is, I know, very difficult to sometimes accommodate young people and at this critical age, and I know she's doing a very good job, but there are going to be some people who will have to be put into other accommodation from their home, and I'm just very concerned that we have those facilities for those people.
We have two types of accommodation run through Solace. So we've got Abergavenny, we've got Woodstock House, and we've got Hill House in Chepstow, and they're for 16 to 25-year-olds. So that's where Ruth would place anybody that couldn't stay at home for whatever reason, and they get their support from there. They have their own room with their own kitchen, bathing facilities and communal lounges. I'd be happy to show anybody around there. They'd welcome you, and to show you all the good work that they do with all the residents there.
Are you happy with the response? And also, Councillor Pratt has requested a day in the life of. Are you happy to invite her to join you for a day? And maybe it'd be interesting for you to report back as well at some point. That'd be good. Thanks. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you very much indeed. It's very informative. Obviously, more youngsters want independence today than what they ever used to have. No matter what reason, there can always be a fallout with teenagers and parents or whatever. But do we recognise enough of the young people always tend to gravitate, not just young people, but any age group really gravitate to the urban areas, whether it's rough sleeping in doorways or whatever. And more of our high streets now are becoming, I suppose, not derelict, that's not the right word, but there's empty buildings in the high streets now that could perhaps be adapted for some sort of sheltered accommodation or one stop for people who are in terrible, desperate need of some sort of accommodation short term, because otherwise they become looking like a slum isn't the right word either, but uninteresting high streets, because you've got empty shops and all that sort of thing, because they're saying more and more shop online. But that building is there, or the several buildings that could accommodate. And we've also seen in planning, we had recently a multiple occupation house in, I believe, Chepstow, wasn't it, Roger? We went to, I think, more have been adapted for that sort of thing, where they've got their secure bedroom but share other facilities. But of course, it's a big cost to renovate these houses or buildings to accommodate. But obviously, the pressure is always going to be on housing, that we're never ever going to be, fully equipped for all our housing. But in these high streets, there's bound to be buildings that perhaps other, charities or whatever could accommodate the young, because that is where they seem to congregate, which is understandable. That's where they feel safest, although even on the news this morning, it isn't necessarily always the homeless that are committing crimes. The crimes are committed to them because they're so vulnerable in their situation. But, I think it's an ongoing problem that we're always going to have. But obviously, Ian and his team that have been with us for a long time now seem to be trying to keep on top of it. But it is a big battle all along.
The high street as an opportunity. Again, we wouldn't disagree with you, and as you say, it ticks all the boxes in terms of supporting the high street as a thriving place. We did do a little bit of work on this a number of years ago. We actually did a survey of the high streets just to get a fair, and it will be out of date now. But what that came back with was what a complex situation it is. You've got shared access with the premises downstairs. You've got fire issues. You've got shared services. And the costs involved with those would obviously be significant. We have talked particularly to Charter Housing Association about that, again about whether they would be willing to do investigative work in respect of that, and I know that the costs were particularly an issue around that. When we had the Abergavenny VVP loan, is it VVP? The town centre loan, that was one of our thinking there, that this could be a funding source that would support, even if it was just 1 or 2 units back into use. But again, that we couldn't make any headway on that. So it's not been for the want of trying, albeit we've not done anything overly recently with regard to that. I think Mark's got a...
Councillor Edwards, do you mind, Mark, I think has got something to add, and then you come back, is that okay?
Yes. I'm sorry, I'll butt in there if I can, please, Mark. It's just that when we did, I was aware that we did some work on it some time ago, when it was, even in Monmouth, there's lots of flats above shops, but the shops themselves now are closing, so you haven't got so much of a problem with shared access and security as when there is a shop. A shop on the ground floor and flats above, because as you say, access is a problem. But now the shops themselves are closing on the high street. The whole building is beginning to look a little bit drab.
Thanks, Chair. This kind of neatly overlaps both my housing hat and my planning hats. So to supplement what Ian said, in terms of the town centres generally, there's a bit of work about to start. We were discussing it yesterday with Kelly around collectively bringing together a bit of a working group around the town centres, possibly through the New Place Board, because we realise that there's an issue with empty shops, some issues around the rates, just the way we're shopping generally is changing. So we need to look at what the future of the high streets are. And then tied in with that will also be the LDP revision, because at the moment we have certain areas of the high streets that are protected for retail uses, and that's all part of the vibrancy and the vitality of the town centres that people know and love, other market towns. But we need to revisit whether those maybe should be shrunk and the outer edges released a bit, or whether we do something slightly different. So these kind of things could apply. We'll have some challenges in some of the properties. If they're historic and they've got really traditional shop fronts, but none of that should be completely insurmountable. But that is something we'd look through in the longer term with the LDP. And in the shorter term, part of the issue we're looking at with the town centres isn't just can we do something else with the empty units, it's how do we stop more becoming empty, or how do we get retail uses back in them if possible, or other daytime cafe type uses. But if the best thing is just to sacrifice those units for those retail type uses, then we can indeed look at residential or different commercial opportunities.
I've got Councillor Brown and then Councillor Dimmick. Just at this juncture, again, we are veering off topic. It's useful because it sets things in context, but just if we can bring it back to the bed and breakfast policy, are we happy with the bed and breakfast policy?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, in relation to the bed and breakfast policy, it looks as if option 3 is the one that's being recommended. Basically out of necessity and not necessarily a policy that we want to have in the long term. So I very much agree with Councillor Grucott's recommendation that it comes back on an annual basis to see how you're progressing with that. I noticed that there are on page 17 a number of bullet points in relation to trying to develop alternative housing options, and obviously bed and breakfast is a last resort, and I wouldn't want to have this sort of bed and breakfast. It is out of necessity that we're doing this, and particularly families. It's awful for families to be in bed and breakfast for a long time, and you want to make sure that they get into secure accommodation. But in terms of the bullet points, I recall from either this report or the next report, which is very much linked, that it was talking about the churches looking at, perhaps some sort of facility over winter where, there is a real risk if you're sleeping out that you could actually die from the cold. And I think the bullet points in here don't actually include any liaison with the churches in relation to this particular, and I think it's quite important because I know that my local church recently organised, with the help of Marks and Spencers, organised a sort of fundraising thing in relation to homelessness. It was sort of a brick and brack thing. It didn't actually. It produced some funding, but there was a sort of a goodwill type of thing there, and obviously there is a concern because I've noticed recently going to Newport that there has been you do notice more people actually sleeping on the streets in sleeping bags, and with when I went recently, and also with tents that you never used to see. And we did have a situation once in our church where a homeless person in Chepstow came to our church. They didn't have any overnight accommodation on a Sunday evening because they'd missed the last bus, and the church decided to help that person. Obviously they haven't got funds necessarily to do that, but I think that's something that could be explored. And I know, for example, there was a Churches Together building, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to be used in the future. So I think it's something that's being missed out from this development plan, which could actually assist. I would certainly also like to participate with Councillor Pratt in the Day in the Life of as well.
I personally think the church is a potential opportunity, and I use the church in the wider context. I think the church is a real opportunity and something that I'm keen to explore further. The focus at the moment is working with a group of churches in Monmouth, and that is something that I have mentioned in the report that is developing, and all being well, as things stand at the moment, I'm hopeful there will be a facility in Monmouth for January and February. There is a draft written proposal which is being worked up. Well, it's being worked up. I say with a view to implementing from January. Now, obviously, that's not mine. The Monmouth Church has obviously been very accommodating towards the council, but it's their model, it's their proposal. And I'm doing everything I can to support that. Our intention is that we will fund that or help fund it, and there will be let's call it a triage type arrangement through the options team. Again, the detail of that has to be worked up. Now, whether we'll be able to access that from a county perspective, I don't know, or whether it will be just Monmouth Reading as itself, I don't know. But in terms of a good step forward, I think we're close to having some provision. I have made a number of contacts. Obviously, we've got a number of church links within the council with other elected members. I have made contact with a couple of those. We've also made contact with the Gateway Church in Abergavenny. So again, I think there's some potential opportunities there. And so we've got these initial strands over and above the Monmouth arrangement, and again, I guess it's a case of gradually pulling them together. I mean, what I was hoping with the Monmouth model, if we can get the Monmouth model off the ground, we've actually got something to say. There it is. We've got something that we can expand and replicate elsewhere in the county. So that's my thinking. But I completely agree with you. There's a real model there. There's a real opportunity there to make those links.
Yeah, that's very encouraging, and I think one of the things is whether or not that can be sort of added as a bullet point in your actions on page 17. Just in general to liaise with churches, just to see if there's anything that can be jointly work together, because I noticed that it was mentioned somewhere in the report, but it doesn't seem to have got not necessarily just Monmouth, but in general terms, because there might be opportunities there that wouldn't necessarily be obvious, but if you just concentrate on the housing associations, for example. Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Dimmitt.
I wasn't going to correct you. Mine sort of goes on from what Jane was saying. Obviously, there's reference to the police being involved, and you speak to them about records and when you're placing people in B&B. Mine is more for those that are vulnerable to themselves. What communication do you have with GPs, medical professionals, with people that are suffering from mental health? Because people that suffer from mental health will more than likely be known by their doctors than the police. When it gets to that stage, it's a little bit late sometimes. So where are they getting involved in the process?
They're involved quite near the start. When someone presents as homeless, we ask for what their medical background is, what medication they're on, speak to medical profession, Hywel Dda and Chepstow, we're in regular contact with the staff there, mind as well. Obviously, anybody with a mental health problem that's quite severe, we would always go to mind first to see if they can accommodate. So we don't just place without considering what their needs are. And as I said, support is put in place as a matter of urgency when they are placed as well. And fully agree that B&B might not be the most suitable for somebody with severe mental health issues, but hopefully Mind would be able to assist then, and their outreach workers as well would be involved. And B&B is only emergency accommodation. Ideally, it's a night to give us the following whole day to work on where we can move them on to that's most appropriate.
Councillor Pavier.
Thanks, Chair. Ian, you talk in the report about, in Annex 3, about regional homeless strategy and possibly regional solutions. Looking at, obviously, there's capacity issues in Monmouthshire. How is that piece developed in terms of opportunities and challenges for joint commissioning with other authorities, and if there's any scope for looking at pool budget work with some other authorities?
I do genuinely believe there are opportunities around that. The conversations at this stage have been relatively basic and limited, probably more process focused at the moment. We've been undertaking a review. It's a statutory review that we're required to do of homeless services in Monmouthshire. That's coming to a close now, and we're now morphing into the joint actions. And I do genuinely think that joint commissioning. I don't know, the point raised about mental health, for example, it could be that there's a mental health resource that's available for the whole of Gwent that we could tap into, for example. The team are paying to a regional prison release arrangement that we do with Caerphilly. So I would hope and want that we would be able to identify opportunities through that, and as you say, pooled opportunities again are also, and it could be anything from, I don't know, one authority covering another to putting the money in a pot to pay for some sort of facility or resource. So yeah, I don't think there's really any limit really to those. I suppose, say at this stage we've not really got into that conversation, those detailed conversations. So I haven't got a sense of what the neighbouring authorities are thinking or expecting at the moment. But I think that'll unravel over the next couple of months, because we've got to have this ready by December.
Okay.
Thanks. Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much for this report. It does explain things very, very well. And I congratulate you on all the work that you're doing. Just a little bit of an explanation about you do have a unit of shared accommodation vacant for emergency purposes. Could you just let me know a little bit about that, and how much use you make of it? And also, I would like to volunteer to join the Day in the Life of. Thank you.
The unit of shared accommodation that we keep empty is a bit of an experiment. It's in response to the safeguarding inspection that we had. We were criticised for the B&B placements. So one of the measures that I decided that we could take was to keep a unit of accommodation empty. We've done that. It's not been used yet, is that right?
No.
It's not been used yet. And obviously we're losing income on it as we're doing it. again, it's one of those that I think if it was left to me personally, I'd have said it doesn't warrant it. But we've responded to the external feedback. We'll give it a year and then see. But that's the issue. We've got a unit of accommodation, but we're losing £6,000 or so on income.
Thanks. This is obviously a really important issue, but I think we've given it the attention it deserves, and I think a lot of the questions lead into the documents anyway. To try and kind of sum up people's thinking, definitely what's coming through is people are finding that this is a really well-written report. I think all three of them are really well written, and I think as members they really appreciate the pressure that you are all under in providing this service to the most vulnerable in our county. Young people has come up regularly. I think there's a real concern about what's out there, what's available for young people, not just in housing, but how you work together with other organisations. And Councillor Dimmick raised mental health and health. So we do work well with many partners. We're still trying to work closely with health, I think that's fair to say. Sort of looking through then in terms of actions, Councillor Crowcutt is suggesting to add 2.4 to the recommendations that we have an annual report on the bed and breakfast usage. And I think again what's come across very clearly from everybody, bed and breakfast is last resort. And the bed and breakfast policy is to make sure that it's quality and it's safe, and those most vulnerable are prioritised for housing if they do fall into bed and breakfast. I think that's fair to say. I'll just steadily go down here with my glasses on because I'm blind otherwise. Councillor Brown suggested an extra bullet point in there, just working with churches, and I think it's a brilliant suggestion. You've already said great opportunities there. Moving down, yes, Councillor Pratt has definitely raised issues of safeguarding, but I think that comes through into the in the bed and breakfast policy, and I think that is linked in there. You've got Councillor Woodhouse, Councillor Pratt, and Councillor Brown want to come and work for you. Is that right? Just quickly going through. Partnership working, that's another thread, really important. And again, Councillor Pavia suggesting the joint commissioning opportunities. And I think everybody, including Councillor Dimmick, has suggested this, the importance of partnership working. And I think you do that anyway. You strive to work with others. I think that's all the actions. Any actions I've missed out there, Hazel? No. Fab. Oh, yes.
Yeah, can I add, Chair, in relation to the annual report on bed and breakfast usage, we also want the policy reviewed because obviously it is a policy of last resort and necessity. Obviously, hopefully we can move away from the bed and breakfast policy so that we've got alternative accommodation. I appreciate that this might be a slower journey than every year, but I don't think you'd want to just review the bed and breakfast usage. I think you'd need to know that the policy itself is under active review as well. And just add that point, please, Chair. Thank you.
Good point, Councillor Brown. Councillor Harris, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quickie, looking at Appendix 2 on page 16, the accommodation overview. I noticed in 17-18 there's a big jump in homelessness determinations, and that is before the rollout of universal credit, which has just happened. How concerned are you about what that is? Universal credit rollout is likely to do here. Do you have concerns or not?
Yeah, we do have concerns. Again, it's a bit of an unknown at the moment. I suppose the I'd like to take comfort from the fact that the previous welfare reform changes haven't manifested themselves in particular issues, but from a homeless perspective, again, I'll say here that the discretionary housing payments is playing a massive role in terms of preventing homelessness. If we reduce that or lose that, then I think that there will be problems. But I think the unknown or the big risk in terms of universal credit is the fact that housing costs now will be paid to individuals, and there's whether we can rely on people to pay their rents responsibly. So it's a wait and see really at this stage.
Thanks. That's a good point to raise, actually. I think that policy's changed a couple of times. It was given directly, then they found there was issues, so they took it from source, and now it's gone back to paying it directly again.
There are measures to support vulnerable people, so it's not as simple as that. But nevertheless, it's the broad principle is that the benefit is paid to individuals because it matches a work arrangement.
So coming back to the policy then, the recommendations was to consider the policy and to ask questions and to make suggestions, and I think we've absolutely done that. And then 2.3, are we happy to recommend it to Cabinet with the addition of the 2.4 that it comes back for review? Are we happy for that to go to Cabinet? Just so that you're aware, we have spent an hour on this, and it's important, and that's brilliant. Going on to policy review of housing renewals policy, and that's on the agenda, number 8. Here. Review of housing renewals policy, number 8. So again, the purpose of this is to consider the draft policy. So we're looking at the content of the policy, and it's basically looking at what does Monmouthshire County Council do for private sector housing, and how they're supported with home improvement monies. So we need to consider the relevance of this and the implications on the private sector households, make any comments and suggestions, and then at the end, are we happy to recommend it to Cabinet? So do you want to do an initial...
Again, not a lot to say. Can I say, just before I do start, Sarah Turvey-Barber's here as the new Housing Renewals Manager. So this comes under Sarah's responsibility. Sarah's only just started, so Sarah's not input or been really involved with this, but ultimately the housing bits fall within Sarah's portfolio going forwards. But yeah, this is a joint policy with environmental health colleagues, and Hugh's particularly worked with us on pulling this together. Similarly with the B&B policy, there's nothing new. I think the most recent addition was you had a report a couple of weeks ago about loans, home improvement loans and empty homes loans. So that's incorporated into here. But otherwise, this is just a review of what we do. So there's no additional costs or anything like that. So it's just formalises everything. It's a joint document, and obviously Hugh's here. If there's any queries in respect of the environmental health responsibilities.
Just in relation to this report, because obviously the next report we're looking at is more broad questioning about how are we doing in terms of dealing with housing homelessness. Is there anything specific on this report that you'd like to make a comment on or ask questions on? Clearly brilliantly written. Yes, yeah. Oh, no, Councillor Harris, great.
The only thing, Chair, just to confirm, the bits in red are bolt-ons to an original policy, or what are they? Why are they in red, in other words?
My poor formatting, I do apologise. So I'll have a look at that, obviously, in terms of that. So no, it's probably what it is probably when I'm editing, I do things in red for my own benefit, and I've obviously not removed that. So apologies.
Councillor Crocott, you had a suggestion that the red meant something significant.
Well, I think, Ian, what the red is just additions to the policy, and largely to take the Wellbeing Future Generations Act and the authority safeguarding policy, and it adds that to your existing policy. So I think it's added a greater clarity. My congratulations.
I'd take that, Ian. I'd take that. No questions for Hugh? No. Very good. Okay then. So we're happy to recommend this through to Cabinet. Yeah. Yeah, all good. Fine, that's good. Oh, sorry.
The only thing I just wanted to add was, again, just this, I think what, when we're doing this, it actually highlights the difficulty providing support to the private sector. We know that social housing is well looked after now, because obviously the arrangements for the Welsh Housing Quality Standard and stock transfer, and we know those properties are of a minimum standard, whereas we know that with the private sector, we've not, there's not a great deal of resources gone in. We're probably providing the statutory minimum. Well, we are providing the statutory minimum. And we've not done a private sector stock condition survey for some years, so again we won't really know what's out there. But I think it's a point of relevance to the committee that, albeit we've got this policy, it's it has its limitations.
Thanks for that. Okay, now we're coming on to item 9, Preventing Homelessness Update Report. So the purpose of this is to provide an update on the progress being made in regardless to homelessness prevention and tackling homelessness. So the recommendations from this that we need to look at is to consider the developments made. We need to use the report to look in depth and scrutinise the services. And we've asked a lot of questions, I think, in the first round, which will link into this. And also to identify any areas of underperformance. To kick off, I think, Ian, we were talking earlier about the sort of red, amber, green of reports. And the red is areas that we need to be aware of, that you have concerns over. And the green are the highlights, the real positives we can celebrate. And we don't necessarily need to know the amber stuff. So if you could, is that all right? Could you summarise to help us know the questions to ask? Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry, Hugh. Oh, thanks. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Personally, I feel the report as a whole is a generally good report. I'm pleased with where we've got to. As you know, it does feel very hard work, and it's the continual battling against the restrictions that we've got in Monmouthshire, such as lack of social housing, private sector rents, etc., etc. But I think overall we're able to report a good position, or slightly better position. The obvious highlight is that our homeless prevention has increased from 58% to 61%. It's only a small percentage, I accept, but I'll take the positives from that. That the trend is in the right direction. I think I think in terms of the Reds, I think I'd go back to the B&B position. I think they're the two pole positions sort of thing. Probably one of the areas of interest, curiosity, is the number of people that are coming through has dropped, and quarter one this year also suggests a slight reduction again in terms of people approaching us about homelessness. Now, I don't know the reason for that. One speculation is that when you go onto Monmouthshire Home Search to apply for housing, there is a pre-assessment questionnaire, and this is a piece of software and a facility that Sarah and Karen have developed over last year or so, and that is designed to steer you in the direction depending on your circumstances. So that would technically, it should potentially steer people away from us if there's no need to approach us. Now whether that's the reason for that, for this drop, we don't know. We don't know, but it is quite an unusual position to be in.
Can I ask a question before I open it out? I'm just concerned homelessness. I mean, even having a house, getting onto the internet is bad enough. But if you're homeless, how can you get on the internet? I know they can go to libraries, but on the whole they don't. So it's how do you pick people up who have got no access to the internet? And I'm just wondering if there is a questionnaire straight away, can people read? And could that actually stop people going to the next stage? I don't know.
At the start of the form, it quite clearly says that you don't have to fill this in online. If you want help, there's a phone number. Part of the app, once you're registered, it is there's a phone app as well. So most people do have mobile phones. Not every, yeah. And support workers, the hubs will help you as well. But Monmouthshire Home Search will phone any applicant back and do it over the phone. And they'll do automatic bids for them, etc. as well if they don't have any access.
Councillor Dimmock.
Just on the Home Search website, what happens if you haven't got a driving licence, a proof of income, a proof of address, or proof of local connection? Like the vast majority won't.
The vast majority do have something that they will take. That is just an example. For us, most people are claiming benefits. We do have to check that they have a right to register for housing. That is in the guidance, and obviously those are the 4 or 5 main things that you would ask for. But some of the our clientele coming through, they don't have their birth certificate. Obviously they don't have a lot with them, but through looking at their benefit, etc., we were able to get a national insurance number and proof of other ID that will be accepted. We've also paid in the past as well for birth certificates using our Spend to Save to be able for them to register and be offered properties for the sake of £15. We help them along.
Yeah, so could we not put birth certificates on the website and maybe a contact us if you haven't got these? I was watching a programme on BBC Two probably about 2 weeks ago. It was on homelessness based in Bristol, and there was a young woman. She'd moved into the area. She had no documents at all, and if she hasn't got a proof of residency or nowhere, she needed that information, and we could be losing, but people are slipping through the net and having to move on to a different location.
We're in the process of actually reviewing the website, so I'll make a note of that certainly, and make sure that it's very clear that if they haven't got the documents mentioned, that, you know, we will look at finding alternatives for them.
Thanks. Councillor Pratt.
Thank you very much, Chair. A couple of questions, really. First of all, have we got any idea of how many people are sofa surfing, as you know, staying in sort of temporarily in people's homes? Do we have any national figures on that? And is that where perhaps some of these hidden people that we don't know about, is that what they're doing? The other thing is, I wonder whether, you know, I've got 3 children, all in their 20s now, and what they're absolutely amazing at doing, they don't stay in bed and breakfasts or hotels, they do Airbnb, and they're really switched into this. And I just wonder if we're really using technology to its greatest extent that we can to try and help us in identifying accommodation and, you know, perhaps finding places that we may not know about. The other thing is that really worries me is, you know, the fact that universal credit, potentially with young people, if they've not had training in budgeting, how to look after their money, then this could be a recipe for disaster. And what sort of help and training do they get? Is it in the curriculum? You know, what sort of help do we give them if they're in this situation so that they can budget? So, thank you.
I can't remember the first question again. Sofa
Have we got
surfing.
any figures on sofa surfers?
Yeah, we can access records from Home Search, because we collate those circumstances through the housing register, so we could get an indication from that. Over and above that, you know, we wouldn't be able to, apart from anecdotal information, probably the housing options team have. But the housing register would give us the main overview of that. Technology in terms of looking for accommodation, we're not close to absolutely anything. We're open to anything that brings something to the table in any shape or form. And then budgeting, I think this is probably one of our greens. We've got 2 whole-time equivalents within the team that provide financial inclusion support. One of those members of staff is dedicated to the homeless prevention for financial issues such as rent arrears, and she goes out, does face-to-face stuff, works intensively with people, and that's been a fantastic additional service to what we have available. And we've got 2 other people, both part-time, who've come into the team, and they're more benefits focused, but again they will work with our clients in terms of particularly those that are in rent arrears when we're in temporary accommodation. So and naturally they will pick up people that go onto universal credit. But I think that financial inclusion service that the team now provides, as I say, is one of our, you know, successes over the last couple of years. And I think there's something there to potentially look at again, and how can we potentially build and develop that if possible.
Can I just come back, Chair? Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for that. And obviously the reason I ask about sofa surfing, because talking to homeless people, that really seems to be the thing that they do last before they then become homeless. So that's why I'm interested. But thank you.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I'm interested in is about liaison with other organisations like the police, for example, on particularly on out-of-hours situations, you know, where they find somebody homeless in the street and it's not the normal working hours, and they need to be able to refer them and have contact telephone numbers and so forth. Is that information readily available? And I can see them nodding, which is quite good. But one of the other things, coming back on the issue about documents, I mean, by the very nature, if the Home Search website puts all these criteria and things that you've got to have, I mean, it's unlikely if you're drifting that you're going to have all of your documents with you, but at the same time you may be in desperate need of accommodation. So how is this overcome in the system, whereby, you know, for example, if a third party found somebody out of hours in need, would you turn around and say, oh, well, I'm afraid they haven't got the proof or whatever, and that you know, obviously we need to know that they're going to get the temporary accommodation that's needed to meet their needs, and, you know, not have a lot of bureaucratic loopholes to go through to actually get help and assistance that they need.
So with the out-of-hours service, it goes through to a housing officer, so they're completely trained as they are in the day. It's actually staffed by us, but we share the system with Torvine and Blaenau Gwent in order to keep costs down. If they ring the general numbers to the council, it also gets transferred to the contact centre, so any which way they come through to us, they find us. The police all have our numbers, so do the hospitals and social services. So if they contact us, we speak to them. If they don't have ID and they can't prove anything, that's fine. We take everything at face value and then we'd investigate it the next day, but we would provide them with accommodation should we have the duty to provide them with accommodation at that point, and then we'd carry out our assessments during the normal working day, but we wouldn't use that as a reason not to accommodate someone as an emergency situation.
Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I was always taught prevention is better than the cure with all sorts of things in life. But do you place sort of leaflets, firstly in doctor surgeries and dispensing chemists and so on? Because very often people are sort of, if they think they're going to become homeless or are, they tend to be on some sort of medication for depression or all sorts of things, and that's where they will sort of sit in a waiting room and browse around and see what leaflets are available. And the same thing in the chemist or in schools or cafes where, you know, youngsters accommodate their daytime routine. So do you put plenty of those sort of things out there?
We work with Lamai, who have a 16, 17-year-old mediation worker. She goes into schools and she does presentations as what the situation would be like, and she gives them information on what to do if they're homeless. The schools contact her if they suspect there may be an issue. So the schools are very well covered in terms of they know who to refer to. They speak to us, they speak to social services, and the support is there in place. With regards to doctors and hospitals, they all have our contact details, so if they think that there may be an issue with housing, they either signpost or they actually have contacted us directly themselves so that we can liaise. We did have leaflets. The problem is our information changes constantly, so they're always sort of advised to go to the website where it has the most updated information, or they are given our contact details straight away.
But then always referring to the website, but there's an awful lot of people in that vulnerable position that haven't got access to any website. But if you're just sat in a waiting room and you can see it, which is more likely to pick that up and read it, because perhaps they don't want other people to be aware of their own circumstances.
We can look at that, and I think picking up on Councillor Paviour's point about the regional work, I think again one of my hopes is there'll be a Gwent suite of information, so we're all providing the same information, and obviously doing it together it will be cheaper and easier to deliver.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I certainly agree with what Councillor Edwards has said, because you know, it would be also helpful if those leaflets were available in a sense. I mean, you wouldn't need a great deal of information. It would be just the emergency contact number for concerns about homelessness is, and that's as far as it needs to go, or the out of hours one is, and you know, that's all the information that's needed. And if that was distributed in a sense not only to GP surgeries but to churches, to as has been said, cafes, businesses, because obviously businesses do come across people who are homeless as well, and even pubs would probably you know, benefit from that sort of information. So although it sounds like you cover the statutory agencies like the police, that you know, you mentioned, I think, was it police, hospital, and was it somewhere else as well? Schools, yeah. That schools aren't open out of hours necessarily, you know, so they're not necessarily the people who come into contact with people in need. So I think it'd be useful if there was a little bit more of spreading of the message, if you could. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions before I summarise? Good. Oh, yes, Councillor Pavia.
Thank you, Chair. It's probably just going back, there's a touch on some of the regional work I was thinking of earlier on, and trying to understand external pressures really around additional support services. So, for example, substance misuse services. Now we've got some excellent organisations working in the county, as the chair will know, likes of GDAS through Kaleidoscope. I know in Chepstow there was some funding concerns, and that was national funding concerns about cuts to local substance misuse services. Obviously, no, there's Gwent Dip as well, and other organisations working within the county. I just want to understand some of those pressures on support services and what that looks like, what that picture looks like, what that landscape looks like at the moment. Is there any concerns that you have, you know, for example, like substance misuse services, that, you know, there's going to be a knock-on impact if something is removed at short term?
The areas of need that you've talked about are big issues for us. It's quite common for applicants to be in that situation, often obviously with mental health issues as well. So that support availability in Monmouthshire is critical, and I say if that was removed, I think that would have a big impact on us. And I would say probably particularly around our the ability for people to engage with us. It affects that. It affects how people manage their own accommodation. We had an example yesterday alone where which was on the back of somebody's circumstances. So I think probably the main way that we access services for clients is through supporting people and the housing support provision. One of the issues within that is getting that support aligned with homelessness. That's quite a challenge. I'm not going to sit here and say everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. So we will say, as a statutory service, obviously we make decisions. Sometimes not everybody is provided with accommodation. Sometimes we point people towards the private rented sector. That's not universally agreed with. So I think there's still a big piece of work to bring bring everything in complete alignment. Exactly how we do that, I'm not quite sure. I mean, we had a conversation this morning alone with Chris Robinson from Supporting People, and Chris understands and recognises the importance that housing support has for homelessness, and it's how we can, it's what mechanisms we can start introducing that will give us that complete alignment. But Supporting People it's a different funding framework. There's obviously other regulations and that are applicable. And of course, it's on a national basis, not on a local basis. But I say to answer your question, take away any of those services, and I'd say those services aren't sufficient anyway. It would cause us problems.
Thanks, Ian. Any more questions? Happy for me to summarise? Yeah. So the reason this has come to us, we have to consider the progress made, and it's been suggested. Really, it's like treading water, isn't it? As soon as you sort of crack one problem, another problem arises because there's so many external pressures and risks involved. But there's a general sort of upward trend, so homelessness prevention has increased. Now, obviously, the vision is to have zero homelessness in Monmouthshire. Good luck with that one then, Ian. Also, to look at, use the report to scrutinise services in contributing to increased prevention, and to look at sort of any underperformance. Councillor Dimmick has suggested reviewing the website and being aware that people may not have any ID, and that can possibly preclude them from coming forward for help. And also a recommendation from Councillor Edwards, seconded by Councillor Brown, in looking at leaflets where people will go to, so they can pick it up and be just more aware of the issues there. I think that sort of sums everything up. It seems to me like resources are good, you were saying that's a green, but the red overwhelming is just lack of affordable housing, lack of emergency housing, lack of homes basically seems to be the issue. And you've got a sort of a toolkit of things that you're bringing together to try and deal with that. You talked about the private stock housing policy. We just wondered if that would be, would it be valuable for that to come to us to look at? What are people thinking about that? Yeah, is there any value? Could we add value to it?
Probably what we bring information to you in respect of disabled facilities grants. So you had a report fairly recently on that, but we could bring you information around the other side of things. So the loans, obviously the environmental health type work. So you're getting more of an insight into private sector housing, so could potentially do something around that.
Thanks for that, Ian. So we're happy for this to go forward. We've made suggestions on areas we're concerned about, and as I say, I think Ian's always very transparent in his reports, and thanks again for that summary, given the green and the red. And we're happy for this to go forward. Yeah, okay, brilliant, thanks. And thank you. I'm going to have to look at my list of names. Ian, Karen, Sarah. Mark, are you off as well?
I might stay for the performance.
Okay, then. I'll not say goodbye to you then. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for that. Okay, so... Thank you. Thank you very much. The next on the list is Agenda 10, so we're looking at performance. Now, it's 11:30, so we're doing well. Do you want to just crack on, or do you want a 5-minute break? Crack on? Hands up for cracking on. Yeah. See? Stamina. Us members, stamina. So, the performance report obviously we know what this is. It's about how well are we doing, targets are set, are we meeting them, missing them, that's what we're looking at. What Richard is looking to do is to just give you a brief training so you know what questions to ask and what you're looking for. How long do you think that'll be, Richard? Just out of interest. Oh, under 10 minutes, right, okay. Fire away.
In which case, Chair.
Sorry.
In which case, Chair, could I excuse myself? That's not quite what I thought it was.
What did you think it was? What did you think it was?
I thought it was actually going through the performance detail, saying how amazing we are with DFGs, that kind of stuff.
Will it?
Well, we sort of are. It will be.
Sorry, could I get you to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sian Schofield, Data Analyst for Social Care and Health.
Richard Jones, Performance Manager.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you for that. As Chair, you've helped to explain. I really want to take the opportunity today, in the context of the performance information presented to you, to run you through our performance framework and help you make sure you've got an understanding about the range of information that forms part of it to help you inform your roles in terms of how you scrutinise the Council's performance. So obviously we've got some specific information in front of you today. I say in Appendix 1 there, we've attached a performance framework. So I just want to remind you of how that operates and the range of information that is available to you on an ongoing basis. And Sian has helped pull together reports here today as well. But I think for the first part, it will mainly be me talking through it. So to start off with, in Appendix 1, when that framework, at the heart of it is our purpose. You can see they're building sustainable and resilient communities, which we share with the Public Service Board in Monmouthshire. So other public service partners who form part of that board share that vision with us. And the Public Service Board have set a wellbeing plan for the county, and as part of that plan they set 4 objectives looking at improving wellbeing, and obviously as a council, as a partner in that board, we have a role to contribute in delivering those objectives. In terms of our role then as a council, specifically we set a corporate plan, and members will recall approving that back in the winter time. And that corporate plan sets 5 priority goals, and included within that is a variety of programmes of activity, 22 in total, that takes us up to 2022. And that also fulfils the council's responsibilities in terms of discharging and producing wellbeing objectives, which is a requirement under the Future Generations Act. So future performance reporting for you will very much be framed around those goals set within the corporate plan. The report in front of you today in Appendix 2 provides you with the progress that has been made against the objectives that were set back in March 2017. And they were set then as part of the requirements under the Future Generations Act to set wellbeing objectives by the end of March. So those were set prior to the last council elections. So some of the previous members would have been part of the council that set those, and some of the new members wouldn't have been. Those wellbeing objectives have been superseded by the corporate plan objectives now, but it is important, and also we have a duty to report back on the objectives which we did set for 2017-18 back in March. So that gives you context about those objectives that are in front of you today. And what we've tried to do within the report in Appendix 2 is set out the progress that's been made, give an indication of some of the key performance metrics relevant to that progress. Link in then how it links to the Future Generations Act, so those goals that are under the Act. And then importantly, show how the objectives we did set back for 2017-18 are continued then in the corporate plan. So it identifies where there are links then to the objectives, the actions which the council will carry forward in the corporate plan. And the value in bringing that together, as you'll see, is a lot of the work within there will form part of your scrutiny work programme on an ongoing basis anyway. And that's what you would expect, because those are some of the biggest areas of work, policy, service development the council is looking to achieve. And it's right that will align to the work you as Scrutiny Committee will look to do. So I would imagine in things there like turning the world upside down, the adult social care approach, you will have already scrutinised recently as part of your work programme. So the value we feel in bringing this together is to remind you of how it contributes to our strategic objectives we set, and place it within the context which you will see it in another report, which is our annual report of our wellbeing objectives. In terms of more frequent updates of performance, coming back to the diagram on Appendix 1, the service business plan element of it. So each of our services in the council has a service business plan. There's 49 of them in total. They're all available on the hub for members to use, and those business plans are updated quarterly, and those are the way in which we translate the vision from the corporate plan into action in the relevant services who are tasked with delivering them. Along with those services use them a range of other information that they're going to use to plan and monitor and evaluate their services, and those plans are set for a 3-year period. So in terms of a range of information on an ongoing basis available to you, those business plans are a really important part of our performance framework for you to use. I'll come back on those. Obviously then link into individual employee aims and objectives, obviously a vital part of the framework in terms of individuals then understanding their role, linked right through to the corporate revision. Another part of the report is performance measures. Performance measures embedded throughout the work we do. We brought before you today 2 sets of performance measures from 2 different frameworks. Again, important to set those within the context of the framework in which they sit, although recognising that you would have already undertaken a lot of scrutiny on these measures already. So the Appendix 3 provides performance measures that are set by Data Cymru, and those are used to benchmark some council services on an annual basis. So we've included the indicators that are relevant, particularly to Adult Select Committee. And as you will see, some of those measures are measures you already scrutinised. The report directly before this on homeless prevention, for example, allowed you to go into a lot more detail around homeless prevention, the service provided in Monmouthshire, than is presented to you today. But we wanted to bring that to you so you reflect on that as part of some of those wider measures within that set. And the second part we brought for you in Appendix 4 is the indicators that are used to measure the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. Again, the level of benchmarking there across Wales used for those, although individual authority performance wasn't published last year. And again, that's brought for you for information today, recognising the scrutiny you already took with Children and People Select Committee on the annual Director of Social Services report, where the Director has brought together a range of information, including these indicators, but also a range of other information to really help you understand how the service is performing. And part of that framework is also reported separately, and we've just brought those back for you today for information, just to give you a complete picture around the level of information available to you to inform your role. So that broadly covers what's in the report, and I hope gives you a bit of understanding about how the various reports we bring to you and will in future fit together as part of our performance framework, and how your work programme throughout the year will pick up some of these more significant activities on an ongoing basis and allow you to scrutinise and hold those services to account as part of it, and also information that may not come before you as a committee, but you will be able to access to inform your wider role and understanding as well. So that's why we've brought these before you today. You may also use it. You may identify new things that you want to use in your work programme, and you may have some specific questions that come out the back of it as well. If we can't answer them, we'll take them back. We're conscious we haven't necessarily got the service managers or chief officers here today to answer all that. And one further point, just for members' information, is the wellbeing objectives in Appendix 2 will form a substantial part then of what we call an annual performance report that will be coming to Council in September. And that will wrap up a much broader overview of our performance in 2017-18, and that's a requirement now under the Future Generation Act legislation. So we're bringing that before Council, and that will include those wellbeing objectives, but also a range of other information such as financial performance, information on governance, and those types of issues. It'll be a much broader report, but we wanted to particularly give you sight of the objectives we set today. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm taking questions. I say conscious we may not be able to answer all of them, but we'll try and get you responses if we need to.
Thanks, Richard. It is helpful. I guess it's kind of like we're all on a journey and we can see over the horizon. So that's the vision, Monmouthshire's vision. And then we have a plan, the steps to get there.
Yeah.
And that's through the priorities and the goals and the 49 business plans.
Yeah.
And then we have the milestones, knowing that we've reached there. So those are your targets and your indicators. So in effect, our job is, there's the dream. We need to know, is it happening on the ground in practice and the impact on our residents. So it's useful to know what we're measuring against. Anybody got any questions on that presentation before scrutinising the actual document? No? Very clear then, Richard. If I open up for questions on the actual performance report, I mean, basically we're looking at it and asking ourselves, how are we doing? Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. A few things here. One I'd like to see, and I've asked before, is we've got this report of how well we're doing, but I'd like if you like, a single summary sheet at the beginning of where we're doing well, where we're not doing well, and areas that you think are of concern that we should be particularly drilling down onto, because there's a lot of figures here, and an awful lot can get lost in that. But a succinct summary of, we should really be aware of this because the trend is getting dangerous, etc. The other thing is, again, where we use percentages, sometimes it is just useful to have a percentage, but most of the time it is useful to have the cohort that percentage goes with. For example, 10% of 10 is entirely different to 10% of 10 million. You know, and if we know the context of that. One other thing, looking on page 113, I'm looking at PAM 012 and PAM 015. We've got an N and a D on both of them, and I'm not quite sure what the N and D are for. And then if you look on PAM 15, number of calendar days taken to deliver a DFG is 17,219. I've got no idea what that means at all. And similarly, turning the page, there's some other ones, like on 114.21, average length of time adults aged 65 or over are supported in residential care homes, 122,532 out of 147. Please, what's that mean?
I think, to take them in order, but I think we'll probably answer a couple of them collectively. Thank you for the questions.
Richard, just before you answer the questions, we were talking earlier, and this is what Councillor Harris was looking at in terms of reports, because Ian Bakewell's report, and when he summarised, we talked about the red, amber, green. Right. So green are the highlights, where we should celebrate, and red are the areas of concern that we need to look at. Yeah. The amber bit we don't need.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of trend information and providing you with that summary, what we want to do is make sure you do have the oversight of performance. That's why we provide all the detail. But I take the point that how we can best then effectively summarise that for you. You know, this report brings you the numbers. We've talked about some of those other reports you would receive that provide you a bit more of the narrative and understanding. For example, the Director's Report in Social Services, that'll give you a bit more narrative. So I take the point on board in terms of future reports, how we can make sure there's clear alignment between our reports and how we can then clearly make sure we highlight those areas you particularly need to focus on, whether that be good performance to be celebrated or performances as well that you need to scrutinise in more detail. To pick up the point around obviously the context of percentages and understanding the trend information, it'll link to your second question around clarifying what some of those numbers mean as well. So in terms of, you highlighted PAM 12 and 15, the N&D provides you the calculation that's been used, so that gives you the context for the percentages essentially, which you were talking about in your second question. So there's been a keyword missed off the calendar days. It should be total number of calendar days taken to deliver DFG, so apologies for that. So that is looking at those 85 DFGs that were delivered. They took a total of 16,384 days if we look at the 2017-18 column. So that was an average of 193 days. So that gives you the context that the average of 193 relates to 85 DFGs delivered within the year. So we've tried to include those in Appendix 3, and also we've included them in Appendix 4, which picks up on your point again. We could maybe label them more clearly. I think you picked up the average length of the time adults are supported in residential care homes one. So that is looking at the total number of days an adult is supported in a care home, and then the total number of adults aged 65 or over who were included in this performance indicator, which was 163 for 17-18. So that gives you the numbers that underpin the percentages. So if you like, some of the demands on our services and the volumes that are in there. So, but I appreciate we haven't labelled them as clearly as we could have, and obviously there's a mission on the one as well.
Can I come in? So the 147 times 833, etc., comes to 122,000.
Sorry.
On that page 114, the average length of time, you've got 833.55. I assume that's days, and if we multiply that by the number of people concerned, 147, does that come out to the total of 122,000?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if we need the total of the days. I think it's frightening.
Just really taking it one step further, I think Councillor Harris is absolutely right to bring this up. I mean, I've been looking at it for 6 years. Councillor Harris, you've been looking at these for a long time, as many other members. The test is, this is a public document, and when you look at it, transparency, it's there for the public to read, so really can they understand it? And I think when we have abbreviations or acronyms, we've got to be clear. We don't fall into that trap, really, of professional speak.
Totally agree with that, and I think obviously some of this is quite technical information that we want to make sure we get accurately across to members the context we set, but reflecting on the public point is a really important part of our work. And I touched upon that annual report earlier that we'll be presenting to Council, and within that we also look at how we can then summarise, because there'll be quite a big document, there'll be quite a lot of analysis in there, how we can then effectively take those messages out of there and communicate them to the public in a way which they find engaging and interesting, because we want them to engage in our performance and understand what it is. So we obviously produce these documents that take quite significant time and effort to pull together. So how can we then translate that into ways understandable? Part of it is obviously making sure language throughout the report is accessible. Part of it then is looking at other ways in which you present them, and we've done things like infographics and things as well. So we're constantly trying to strike that balance, and appreciate we don't always probably get it right, but we're working on it.
Just so that people know that they're not getting missed out, I have got Councillor Crowcutt, then Councillor Edwards, then Councillor Brown at the minute. So, Martin?
I was just wondering, in a slightly wider context, the council has a responsibility to scrutinise the work of the Public Service Board. Do you use a similar sorts of measurements to measure the effectiveness of the wider movement towards those wider PSB goals?
Happy to answer that. The answer is, I think, as part of last Public Service Board Select Committee, that the Public Service Board has developed an action plan, has developed wellbeing objectives and number of steps. It's now looking at the actions it wants to take to deliver those steps. And as part of that, there'll be a performance framework undoubtedly put around that will bring together a range of performance information to judge effectiveness, and that will be a mixture of some of the higher level population level indicators that indicate a broader direction of travel, and then some more specific metrics around performance that will be relevant to those projects that are in place. Obviously, where we as a council contribute to the Public Service Board work, some of those indicators may be the same in terms of some of the specifics of our work. And certainly when we look at some of those indicators around some broader trends around wellbeing and high levels of population type indicators, they're going to be often quite consistent with how we as a council will look to evaluate our performance as well. They won't always exactly match up, but there will certainly be some read across between the two. And as part of that work, then establishing that action plan for the PSB, will be putting in place a framework for performance that will be, you know, taken on points and the points made around accessibility, etc., will form a purpose for the governance of the PSB, and then obviously through to scrutiny as part of those governance arrangements as well. But through our corporate reporting as a council, we always got to be mindful of how we demonstrate our links to the Public Service Board's wellbeing plan objectives as well.
I'll go over to Councillor Edwards, but I'm just wondering if we can, when looking at the report, look at any areas that you have got concerns content-wise as well.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Richard and Sian, for your very detailed, I must add. So I'm sure you could take quite a while, you know, picking through it and highlighting different things. Transfer of care, obviously that's going to get a bigger concern, do you think, now when we're having more of an aged population? So are we going to have enough staff and facilities to take the pressure off in some ways? Because obviously, as we've got a more aged population, they might start off at 70 needing care, but then it gets more complex if they're in the system as they get older. So are we going to have enough resources and staff and so on to help with that problem?
I think perhaps I can answer some of that. We have seen a big increase in the number of delays this year. And what we've noticed is particularly in community hospitals, so not in the big acute hospitals where arrangements are quite good for getting people out quickly. But people then are in community hospitals where they have very complex needs, as you say. And what we've also found this year is the majority of those delays, for social care reasons at least, are awaiting care at home packages. We've found this year we've had some issues where some of the providers have left the market and left gaps in the market. So we've had issues this year with those sorts of problems you mentioned, which, as you say, with the ageing population, potentially could get worse. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was looking again at this issue that Councillor Harris mentioned about it being very useful if all of the tables say not only percentages but numbers as well. And, you know, that's very useful. Even on page 112, where we're looking at the delayed transfer, in the note it mentions about the number of people, but it's not within the block graphs, the number of people. And I think that would be useful. Looking at page 114, basically, I'm just focusing on number 22, which says the average age of adults entering residential care homes, and it basically says that between 2016-17 and 2017-18, the average age has gone up, and it mentions 83.78 years, which I assume is basically 93 people who've all of their ages has accumulated to 7,792. But again, it would be helpful if the figures that are produced, you'd put in brackets what they mean underneath so that we can easily understand that. The other issue looking at this is that the average age in Wales is 82.83, and then we've got a red mark that says bottom. Well, basically I would have thought it was better the higher age people did enter into residential care homes rather than lower. So And also, why do some of these performance measures not have targets against them? Because some are saying not applicable or whatever. So how can we, and then you've got crosses and ticks in that box as to whether we've met target. But if you're having things that say non-applicable, then how can we measure performance? Because you haven't actually put in any targets.
I think, again, this is one perhaps I can explain. You're correct, absolutely correct in the way that the indicator is calculated. The bottom quartile relates to our 2016-17 performance, where we were lower than the Welsh average. And that was an error on my part because we had included some younger adults who were in temporary rehabilitation placements and they shouldn't have been included. So we've rectified that for this year, which is why you see the increase within a year. In terms of why we didn't set targets, these were new indicators for 2016-17, and at the time of setting targets for 17-18, we didn't have any benchmarking data from Welsh Government at that point. So it was very difficult for us. We didn't have a Welsh average. We didn't have those quartile positions. So we really didn't have a feel for how we were stacking up in Wales and where our target should be, really. So I think going forward for the year ahead, we can set more realistic targets now, having 1 year's worth of Welsh data to work with as well.
Yeah, so basically looking at this table, effectively, because the coloured markings are the 2016-17 quartile, because we were, I don't understand why, presumably, we should be doing better than, you know, that instead of being marked in red for this year, it should be marked in green, presumably.
Just to really add a bit of context and to answer the follow-up question, really. The benchmarking information is not published until later in the year, but obviously we want to bring before you our own council individual performance in a timely way, which is why we presented it, and we wanted to give you context of where we sat in terms of the 2016-17 quartile information, so where we benchmarked across Wales. When new information is published, it's usually around October time, we will refresh that and look at how we compared ourselves to 2017-18 across Wales. I just want to pick up really a point around target setting. Sian's helped explain sort of the position as it was in 2016-17. Obviously, as you've mentioned, in terms of what does good look like when you look at average age of adults entering residential care homes, is it right that we set a target for that? We'd obviously wouldn't want people to enter in care homes earlier in life, but actually it's very difficult to sometimes nail an accurate figure if you look at the data to what actually good looks like. So it's a metric almost we can track. Whether it's how effective that then is in terms of measuring our performance as such is more maybe difficult to quantify, but it is an indicator set by Welsh Government to measure progress in Social Service and Wellbeing Act. It's a helpful bit of metric data for us to understand. Is it a true indicator of our performance? It may not be. And in terms of the red, that might link to, in terms of that's comparing us against Wales and the other average ages. It's again, we were in, as classed there through the Welsh Government quartiles bottom, but again, it's about understanding really what does good look like and what does that mean and what would we do differently, really. So I think that sort of understanding we can help give you through the reports as well. And obviously then when we're looking at other measures of our performance, making sure that they're appropriate to measuring the right things that show us how well we're doing in our services as well. So it's always a bit of lack of clarity, but hopefully we get better, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, presumably, taking in account that, am I right in saying that effectively, because our ages are higher in terms of entering residential care homes at 83.78 rather than the average in 82.83, which was in 2016-17, we haven't got the figures of the average for 2017-18 for Wales, but presumably we are doing better in getting people. Shouldn't that be, in a sense, a positive measure, because presumably we're getting people in later in life, and I would have thought that people don't necessarily want to go in care homes anyway, and it's a last measure. So the table in that sense and the traffic light markings are somewhat difficult.
And absolutely, agree with that. the quartile, the traffic light is based on what other people are performing as well. So it's comparing us to other councils in Wales and how they're performing. So obviously that's relative to them. Obviously we've seen an increase in the average age this year, which would be positive. And obviously when we update that traffic light then, it may mean that looks more positive as well, but it may mean actually that other councils' average age is higher as well, and it may not be, but that's the position at the moment. But it's the comparable piece there, rather than our individual
statistics, eh? Are there any other questions, particularly around anything that you've seen in red or areas of concern that you want to raise? We're just saying in future, I have to say Richard and Sean are brilliant in answering the questions, but we're saying any performance documents like this in future, we'll be inviting Julie Boothroyd, because she's the new Chief Officer for this area, and we need her here to answer the questions. But at this point, Councillor Edwards, yeah?
Just one thing. On the graph, it said, I know who to contact about my care and support. And it says 87% say they do, but there's still some that obviously don't know how to go about getting their care and support.
So and that's based on surveys that are undertaken with our adult service users, and the table below gives you a bit of a breakdown. So obviously that's then information to understand actually where can we look then to target some improvements in terms of from making sure that everyone feels that they can access information about care and support that they need to. Just to pick up the point around, I completely agree in terms of accountability for to be answered by the Chief Officer. Obviously what we're doing here is presenting a report that you've already had a chance to scrutinise through the Director of Social Services report as well, and this information was contained in there, so just wanted to make sure the committee are aware that has been there. Okay.
Are we good? Okay, so we've definitely gone through that. Just to pick up Councillor Harris's suggestions, I suppose it's kind of somehow putting a summary. And I think, Richard, you're saying there's different reports depending on different audiences. I think that's what you're looking at. We like numbers. Percentages are good, but we like numbers as well. And just for us to be careful on abbreviations and acronyms. But no, thanks for that report. Are you all okay? Okay, everybody. So we have Mark Howcroft here looking at the revenue and capital monitoring. So I guess this is a financial health check. And again, we're looking, is there value for money? Have we got quality services? Over to Mark.
Can I check this is on? Yep, great. Tyrone would normally present this to you. Tyrone's away from the organisation at the moment, which I guess from one perspective is useful to give you. I probably have a wider perspective of the organisation more generally. I will try to attempt to answer all your inquiries in relation to the adult portfolio, but I may very well need to take one or two of them away with me. So this follows on from Cabinet's consideration of the outturn on the 6th of June. There is a higher half-life to this information insofar as there's probably no ability to influence the outturn after the year end, but it's very useful in terms of Select's role in terms of holding Cabinet to account in relation to paragraph 1.2, so that the Selects will consider as part of their responsibility the assessment whether effective budget monitoring is taking place, monitor the extent to which budgets are spent in accordance with agreed budget and policy framework, challenge the reasonableness of projected overspends or underspends, and monitor the achievement of predicted efficiency gains or progress in relation to the savings proposal, appreciating that it is Council that set the budget annually and that you will have had a hand in agreeing what those savings proposals are for the year. So the headline messages for the year was that an outturn of £653,000 surplus was achieved in revenue terms. That sounds like a lot of money, but in relation to an overall budget of 140 odd million, that's a variance of probably less than 0.6%. So just to give you an indication of how small that is in the overall quantum of money that is being managed through the year. In terms of capital doesn't really affect the adult portfolio that much, other than property maintenance at perhaps Mardy Park. But there was capital slippage in relation to the Future Schools programme of 11.8 million, which will transfer into this year's programme, and a net underspending of 395,000, largely savings in relation to a couple of Section 106 schemes and an IT refresh within schools that's included in paragraph 3.5.9. What I went on to tell Cabinet was that paragraph 3.23 is quite important in relation to the risks that we anticipate for the next 4 years. It describes the environment affecting local authority funding. It explains that actually in relation to savings, that actually members should be critical and ask questions of how those savings will be achieved in practice, because the difference between success and failure is often the implementation or the onboarding of any savings. It also explains that the officers will increasingly be asking you to actually look at new ways of working and developing new practices. Some of those things will be identified as being commercial or innovative. What it stresses is that not necessarily do we have those inherent skills that the private sector has in relation to commercialism and innovation. It's not that we shouldn't be doing those things. We certainly need to actually help sustain our traditional business models, but that members should be highly critical and inquiring of the practices around that, because one of the things that is unusual for the public sector is that where the private sector can try things out and divest themselves where they don't work or don't meet the agreed aim, it's a lot more difficult to do that in a lens of public accountability and accounting for the stewardship of the public purse. So what we often find in relation to these things is that things might get volunteered to you on the basis of financial efficiency, and when the financial efficiency doesn't get achieved at the level that we anticipate, it's then looked at a similar lens around the fact that, well, this is a fantastic service to the electorate, and invariably it is. But what I would encourage members to do is to evaluate those things against the original purpose that they were actually presented to you against. Paragraph 3.3.4 provides the monitoring information in relation to adult services more generally. So you can see that adults overspent by 242,000, but actually ended up, as a result of saving in community care and commissioning, in a net surplus position. The increase in that surplus being 520,000 on the month 7 position, and helped to sustain some of the extra volatility that was introduced with children's services. I think the pressure in adult services, you can appreciate that round about that time we had that period of inclement weather. Care at home increased from month 7 as being an outturn overspend of £12,000 to £156,000 at outturn, and it's not unreasonable to expect a lot of that down to the additional support and additional costs associated with that inclement winter weather. We have got some resourcing back from Welsh Government in relation to highway clearance and social care more generally, but often that money doesn't actually extend as far as the overall costs that it actually incurs. The savings are described in 3.4.7, and you'll be pleased to know that in relation to adult, those 13 savings were anticipated to be delivered in full. You can see those in Appendix 2 if you want to have a look at the detail, which I believe is page 140 of your bundle if you have any queries about them. As mentioned earlier, adult doesn't have a great capital footprint. It only had a programme of about £2,000 worth of repairs in relation to Mardy Park flooring work, which was incurred in full. No other underspends or overspends there. Reserve usage. It's very relevant to keep all members up to date with the level of level of reserves that we hold, because we're actually using them at a higher incremental rate than we're actually replenishing them. So that £653,000 balance at the end of the year could have gone into general reserves. What we actually did was choose to replenish the priority investment reserve, capital generation reserve, and put the balance to invest and redesign reserve, appreciating that's likely to be where the majority of spend is going to be in future years. Now, if I just stress about earmark reserves, you don't actually have to hold earmark reserves. They are ones that you set up for a particular purpose, and they will disappear once that purpose has been served. However, part of those purposes that we set them up for is to help deliver re-engineering and redesign, and actually so it is quite important about the levels that we hold in relation to other authorities as a good comparison, because actually the ability for us to redesign services is influenced by quite often by the pump priming of new ways of working, training, etc., and obviously that's a finite sum of money. So I describe a situation that over the period of 17-18 we used £1 million of our 15 million reserves, and I predict that in 18-19 we will use a further 1.5 million against that, taking it down to about 12.5 million. In terms of reserve usage, well, in relation to social care, the predominance there is a use to support the business cases of children's services, although I do note that there is actually a small degree of reserve usage in relation to facilitating the social care leadership review. And at that point, having taken you through the report fairly quickly, I'm happy to take any specific questions you might have.
Thanks, Mark. I think with looking at the revenue and capital monitoring, I think we're all aware that we've got increased borrowing, we've got decreased reserves, we've got decreased Welsh Government settlements, we've got increased demand and increased expectations, and we need to have a balanced budget to kind of keep all that afloat, really. So I guess for us, we're looking at this and asking ourselves, are we confident that we have a robust medium and long-term financial plan in place? And I would also add, when we do look at savings, we need to ask the question, when we make those savings, what's the impact on people's lives in Monmouthshire and the service delivery? So with that, any questions on this report for Mark? Councillor Pratt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that report. I'd just like to ask a question about the winter, really, and I noticed that it says that we didn't achieve our savings of 30,000, which in the scheme of things is, significant, but not an enormous amount. But I just wondered if we got any idea what the winter cost us, because obviously we had very difficult conditions where I live in Llanelli Hill. It was very expensive. We had to get special equipment up there to clear the roads, and obviously you've got the knock-on effect of social care, of people falling over, etc., needing more care in their home. Do we have any idea of what cost to the council is a bad winter like the one we just had?
I can certainly get that information. It would have been part of a bid to Welsh Government in relation to a proportionate funding return to us. So rather than quote any specific figures, I'll get the team to actually passport that on to you through the chair. What I would describe to you is that our approach to adult social care is very much about care in the community and care at home necessarily. So taking the point around the performance report that you had earlier, it is welcome that actually our age of people going into residential care units is probably less than the Welsh average, because that is our stance and strategy.
Yeah.
However, that has implications around getting to people's home during the winter time, and It is obviously more onerous to do so. Yeah. I described looking at the budget for care at home, it was predicting £12,000 overspend coming up to Christmas time, and by the end of the year it had overspent by £150,000. Simplistically, you can say that was the net cost of it, but I don't know how much of that is related to money that we had in from Welsh Government that has reduced our pressure, so I will find that out for you.
Yes, do.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I'm currently having a battle asking if certain roads in my ward can be gritted, and because there's people living down that road that have got complex needs, they're, immobile, disabled, and yet I cannot get those routes on the standard gritting route. So, it does have a big knock-on effect, and I think, when our budgets are so tight, we only need to have another winter like that, and it can really impact our budget. So I'd really appreciate knowing how much it cost us and what support we had from Welsh Government. Thank you.
Richard, have you noted that as an action? Brilliant, thanks.
Sorry, understanding your perspective about the highways, I'm probably a lot closer to that than I am around the individual costs of the social care aspect. Our cost for the additional gritting as a result of the winter period at the end of March was over £400,000. We got £33,000 back from Welsh Government. Their decision was that, local authorities had provided them with a wide disparity of figures, and therefore they wondered whether some had understated the cost. So actually what they decided to do was to aggregate the money they were going to provide on the same basis as their RSG and capital funding. We know historically we're the worst per capita on that basis, so we were never going to be advantaged from that situation. But it does sound a bit perverse that actually a rural county that has more problems and more costs associated with dealing with winter positions than perhaps the coastal situation, which is at a lower elevation, probably less likely to have the same degree of snow, also has the sea breezes coming in. That means that they're more clement. So for the funding to go predominantly to the likes of Cardiff and Swansea, etc., it feels a bit aggrieving, but.
Can I just come back and just say that thank you very much for that information, and it really just demonstrates, I don't want to be political, that, but the Welsh Government are, city-centric, and we had 10-foot drifts where I live, and those people that depend upon care services, I spent the whole weekend on the phone, and I really appreciated the hard work of our departments, highways, in getting those roads cleared. They were absolutely fantastic. But a cost of $400,000 to a council like ours, which is really looking at every single penny, is, we only need another winter like that. And, it means that we're going to have to cut back on other things. So that's very worrying. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pratt. I think that's absolutely right. What your concerns. Is there any way, or are we doing anything about challenging the formula in anticipation of a possible next year?
My A board is a little worn out in terms of going down to the Welsh Government and fighting our corner. As members will do, the problem that you've got with any changes of the former is that it has to be done by agreement, suggesting that 22 authorities will necessarily agree to advantage some and disadvantage others. Suspects to me that the formulas will only get adjusted around the margins. We have in the past argued successfully about the rurality, and you may remember the year before last we got an extra amount of money in our budget. I was interested about the debate you had earlier about the sustainability of social care funding more generally. I was recently at a Welsh Treasurers meeting that was talking about the discretionary tax raising powers that Welsh Government were intent to derive in the next 12 months, and one of the things that they were considering is similar to England around the income tax consequence helping to afford social care. What they did describe to me was that when I asked them about any sort of figures and whether they felt this was a panacea or not, they explained to me that a 1% increase to income tax levels would likely have a £200 million effect in Wales, which probably still wouldn't be sufficient to satisfy the pressures that you rightly describe about an increasingly elderly population, around some of the volatility around dealing with children's cases and the legal dimensions thereof. So I'm not sure necessarily I would regard that as a panacea approach to it per se, but I do know that we're trying to advantage our approach in understanding the activity data that Welsh Government use in actually providing the calculation. So for instance, some of that information is around things like number of free school meals, the degree of deprivation in a local authority. Unfortunately, they regard Monmouthshire as fairly affluent and therefore able to rely more heavily on its council tax and discretionary fees and charges. You may recall that actually one of the things that we're actually doing now is actually putting together a campaign and using Torfaen colleagues in the benefit sector to actually advocate free school meal entitlement, etc., which will have a knock-on effect in terms of our proportionate funding, but it is obviously on a delayed basis.
Thanks, Mark. You've succeeded to depress me now. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I've been here 14 years, as already been mentioned, and and suddenly the Welsh Government is responsible for the fact that Llanelli Hill didn't get its roads gritted by this council, and the fact we're the lowest funded, and we always have been. And all that time, we've had a Conservative AM, one of which was an MP at the same time. We still have, we're talking about not being political, but unfortunately, it keeps coming up, and it is political. We are looking at a budget here where, through Mark's good works and people with him, have come with a surplus of 652,000. That's what we should be congratulating on. And it's been the same in all the years that I've been here. The budget planning here is, and I'm a member of the opposition, it is magnificent. It comes out and it's never failed to produce a surplus. So the medium-term financial planning is good as far as I'm concerned. There's no doubt about that. So if somebody just finishing off the political bit can tell me after 14 years why we're the lowest funded authority and what anyone else is doing about correcting it, I'll be ever so pleased so that it doesn't ever get mentioned again. You never know. Live in hope. What I'd like to know, Mark, is on the capital. There's slippage mentioned every year, and we're talking about nearly 12 million now. How much is that a ruse or not? Just to make the figures balance, because if you're talking about 12 million quid out of about 48 million quid, that's not actually included, then you can do all sorts of things with that.
Firstly, Councillor Harris, if I've suggested to you that actually our financial predicament is a political one, please accept my apologies. I suspect I would be advocating the formula is actually derived by the 22 local authorities. It is them predominantly that are influencing that particular change. It's not necessarily local government, necessarily central government, albeit it's difficult to see that in the forthcoming 4 years that they are likely to incentivise funding towards local authorities as opposed to health. So I suspect that actually we will continue to see that expectation that we become more sustainable without that public sector funding. Unfortunately, I think that's just a sign of the times, irrespective of who's in charge of it. In relation to your specific query about slippage levels, it's not a manufactured figure, although to raise the veil on some of the darker arts of treasury management, I do rely quite heavily on people's slippage figures to affect my treasury costs. So annually, you'll remember that actually net cost of services are generally overspent or in a deficit position, and it's normally recovered through either treasury and council tax receipts. So I do, in the back of my mind, rely on a degree of slippage, which means that actually I'm not having to borrow in the year, which obviously the budget presumed that I did, so I get a benefit effect of that. My conversations with individual service managers is I'm not a great fan of taking longer than you necessarily need to take with your capital resources. By definition, capital projects will normally take longer than revenue, and therefore they can be multi-year consequences. So it's more usual to have slippage in capital than it is revenue. My belief is that people should do their damnedest to incur the spend that members have gratefully bestowed upon them in the annual budget process. And some of the interesting conversations that I have around slippage requests in regarding whether it's actually slippage and them moving their budget between financial years, or whether it's more truly an underspend that they haven't got any aspirations or haven't started the work, are quite intense. So whilst you don't see those, it's probably the reason why I don't get many Christmas cards from one or two individuals.
Councillor Brown and then Councillor Edwards.
Yes, thank you. I do think you deserve congratulations in managing a budget that is difficult. I appreciate that Councillor Harris has been here a number of years, but the fact is that there are local authorities per head of capita who get almost 50% more per person than Monmouthshire does, and we're 22 out of 22 authorities in terms of the money that we get from Welsh Government. The ruling group, both in Welsh Government and also in local authorities, is one particular party. But I mean, the factual point is about the amount we get per head of population. Looking at that and drumming down to the figures, you mentioned page, as I'm a detailed person, you mentioned page 140, and obviously that does give some of the details of the particular savings that are being put forward. In terms of the protocol of reporting finances, I have asked previously in other committees whether it's possible to put figures that help us in terms of the financial side and are in credit rather than debit in black as opposed to in red, because there is this convention to tend to think of red as making the situation worse rather than better. I know that the fire authority does it in the normal way when they report things that are in red are basically things that aren't a budget, whereas things that in black are on the surplus side. But it's unfortunate actually, Chair, that the Director of Social Services isn't here, because if you look at page 140, it would have been nice to have had a report back on, how these savings were going and, what difficulties or otherwise there were with them. I appreciate things like a detailed contract review, which saved is that presumably 56,000? I mean, that is understandable, but some of the other issues, for example, like why a particular termination of a room rental happened. I mean, I know these are only minor things, but they do make a difference. And also there seems to be a saving in exploring living carer rather than hourly cost via care agency. And living carers, to me, does seem like a good idea, and it would have been nice to have had some sort of comment on that. And also, obviously from the practical perspective, not necessarily from the financial perspective, how these particular issues were working out and an explanation of them. And as I say, I think it's a shame that we don't have somebody from the director here to explain those cuts and how they're going. I mean, I don't know whether you can explain how they're going or whether they've been realised or what. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, that would be helpful. There is a social care director's commentary which gives a state of the nation about their services that's embedded on page 124. I don't know the specific details and the net consequence to the service as a result of those service savings, but what I would say is that this is a fairly regular report for you in terms of standard format with standard degrees of savings. When you receive the month 2 position, you could always ask the director to come and just give you an out-term perspective on last year's savings, because by then that person will be longer in the organisation, probably have a better understanding than they do at the moment.
I was just talking to Hazel, and we mentioned earlier that if we get the performance report, we do need Julie Boothroyd, because she's just been given that job, and finances and performance come together, so she'll be here to be able to tell the story behind the figures there. Councillor Edwards, sorry.
Thank you, yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark, for a very detailed report as usual. I've not got a head for figures. I'll be the first one to admit that. And budgeting, well, none of us can budget very well when it comes to households, let alone an authority. And you can't predict things really and expect everything's going to go hunky-dory, like the weather. We were saying the pressure of this last winter. In Pacific times, there was an awful lot of snow, and I'm in a very rural area, and of course people like to come and live in the countryside when they retire. They're then older as far as living in the area is concerned, and they expect sometimes to have the same facilities that they have when they were living in an urban area. And this is why I think we need some sort of more acknowledgement that when we're saying people to be encouraged to live in their own homes, especially as they get older, and we do not accommodate them well enough in the community to downsize into bungalows or whatever. I mean, you can imagine you're up a lane, 7 or 8 miles from anywhere, there's I don't know how much snow, and they need help. And very often the people around them then do not know that Mrs. Jones has fallen, or whether she's got family or anything. And we don't seem to get that overall picture of what it is that is needed when you do go and live in isolated areas. Well, not just isolated, but even in a rural or a small village, that you do need to know the people around you, which will help our community services, you know, in social care where it is needed. In, as we say, we can't predict what the weather's going to be like. I believe now we're going to have issues now. We've had the cold weather, we've now got the hot weather, and tarmac is raising because of the heat, and that is going to be extra expense now for the authority. And so all the time we've got pressures, wherever you look at it, on the budget. And in some instances, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul and all that sort of thing, and as the slippage you say. But it's how you do come out with a budget like you do, Mark, and balance it the best that you can, is to be applauded by all members of Monmouthshire, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Edwards. I think Councillor Edwards does share all our frustrations, and I think in a nutshell you're trying to say that within Monmouthshire we need to develop a culture of looking out for one another. Yeah. Councillor Woodhouse.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, my support for what you've done here, Mark, is fantastic. All the good work. I regularly hear at select committee meetings members asking the same questions really about the accounts. There's a lot of information you're giving over to us at these meetings. You're obviously having to go through it many times. Do you think it would be appropriate to hold a members' seminar and perhaps go into a bit more detail with these accounts? It would save you repeating the same information, hopefully. But at the end of the day, it would give us a further understanding, a better understanding of how the accounts work, in particular, as has been mentioned by Councillor Brown, the fact that some figures are in red and some figures are bracketed. We had an induction training, yes, but it would be nice, I think, at this stage, perhaps to ask members if they would like to see this sort of thing happen. Maybe Democratic Services could have it on their agenda for one of their meetings, ask members if they would like it. Wouldn't want to waste your time, but obviously it would be useful if there's enough members present to go into a bit more depth with regard to understanding of these accounts.
I was going to actually reference the induction training. I don't know from a first-hand experience whether you found that particularly useful. It was nice to actually get behind some of the issues to explain first principles to members that we often assume you already know. Part of the reason for this report is twofold. A, I realise that this is the adult portfolio, but as members more generally, you're probably expected in your community to know all things about the council and what's going on. So hopefully that wider perspective is quite useful to you. What I have encouraged people to do, if they have any particular interest, because actually gauging the level of interest or particular issues that people have is quite difficult in scheduling a training session. One or two members periodically take me up on the opportunity to have a half an hour or an hour to go through to understand issues in perhaps a bit more detail, and I'd be very happy to speak with any of you, because actually what I get out from that is that I get a more informed member, that actually when you push the praise my way and say, well, this is a wonderful job you've done, actually I turn that back and say to you, there aren't many organisations that have the same number of products as a local authority in terms of delivery. The public's perception about that local authority and what services its value changes through their life. If they've got children, it will probably be education. If they're getting towards the end of their working life and they're more interested in looking at the social care aspect. So actually it's a very fluid model in terms of satisfying the public and the people that actually put you into your positions for representing them. So I actually think this is testament to members in terms of having a budget that covers off so many different products, so many different interests, and generally works from a basis of everyone in the electorate aren't necessarily screaming about we need to be spending more on this, we need to be spending more on that. But if it's at all helpful to you in terms of understanding why we necessarily do things from a financial basis, I'm very happy to have those conversations with you.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's right. When you have an induction, you kind of don't know what you need to know, and it's not till later you realise what you need. So there's sort of two elements. You're happy to have one-on-one showing people the dark arts. Sure. The other, can we have a sort of a seminar for members? Would that be good? So individuals can contact Mark if there's specifics to go through, but also to perhaps put out a generic.
Yeah, I think if there's interest from members, a members' seminar would be a good route to go. It's something that I think everybody needs to understand in the same sort of detail, really, the cabinet members and yourselves, but from different perspectives, obviously, according to your roles. So if that's supported by this committee, we and Mark thinks it's something that he would like to do. I mean, we've often talked in the past, Mark, about members having more of a role in scrutinising finance and understanding the detail behind the figures. So if that's something that there's will to do, I'm guessing now you're thinking autumn.
One of the things I'm very conscious of is not bringing members into the organisation more so than they would normally come in. So I'm wondering whether, actually just thinking aloud, whether we might be able to design something around the budget process in terms of giving you a better context about some of these services before you go into the budget process from September to December onwards.
Sounds like a plan. Councillor Pavia, I haven't forgotten you.
Thank you, Chair. You will remember being a former member of the Economy and Development Select. The Select Committee members wanted a more detailed knowledge transfer stroke scrutiny session on the local government funding formula, and wanted the WLGA and Welsh Government to come in and do a piece with us. And I think that whole committee agreed on that, and it was something, as chair, I said I would take away and try and facilitate. It would be great if you and this committee could add your name to that list, and we can get that push forward, because it's something that's needed on top of the internal financial knowledge that Mark just referred to as well.
Hazel's just wondering, should we have the internal session and then have Welsh Government come in and look at the settlement? Would that be the best order? Controversial. What would Mark suggest? Be diplomatic here.
Being diplomatic, I think whatever I suggest is going to be wrong. So, can I go away and actually speak to my WLGA counterparts? I'm not quite sure who I can visualise from Welsh Government that would be prepared to stick their head above the parapet at the start of a local authority budget round. But
kind and gentle people.
but if I can do some digging and report back to you, yeah.
Sorry, Chair, just to come back on that, it would be useful to have someone from Welsh Government there, because it does come to, when it comes to the end of December and the sign-off in the National Assembly of relevant budgets, the pushback from Welsh Government is always, well, this is your funding formula. You know, yes, ministers signing off, but you decide that. And you know, I understand the complexities of bartering between 22 local government authorities and how that would play out with, you know, some being worse off than others. But they've got, you know, they've got an interest in this, a vested interest, and I think it would be appropriate for, I'm not saying, you know, a departmental head, but someone, you know, even if it, you know, in their policy division, you know, finance policy, would be able to come with someone from local government association. I think it'd be important.
Are there any other questions on this report? No. So to summarise then, well, definitely we've had an interesting discussion on who to blame. I'm an independent and I blame you all. Councillor Brown made a good suggestion in terms of when you're looking at savings, we need the right people here to get some report on those savings and the impact on the service delivery. Also, she asked questions around the black-red. It is true that the reports we get, red means good, black means bad, but out in the real world it's the other way around, so I don't know what we can do about that.
Well, I am following the common convention out there, so I mean, red and a minus is generally related to income in accounting terms, so a saving or a reduction in expenditure probably is rightly a minus aspect, but I don't want to confuse anyone, but I think equally doing it the other way might confuse other people. So as long as I can explain probably at the outset what that means, and or put on the headings whether a minus represents a good thing or a bad thing, then that might be as good as I can do.
I think it takes in Councillor Woodhouse's suggestion, because we're going to have internal training so that we've got a better understanding of it. Councillor Pratt made an excellent comment, really, highlighting issues around emergency money and raised the issues around the winter funding. And you're going to get back to us on the winter funding. Although you've highlighted the expenditure on highways. And then I suppose it links in with Councillor Pratt and Councillor Pavier. We do need the Welsh Government here to look at the settlement and for them to listen to us as well, and for them to make sense of the settlement for us, and that will be an action, and we'll support economy and development in pushing that forward. And any support or help we can give you, Councillor Pavier, to push this forward, more than happy to do that. So the purpose of this was to look at the revenue and capital monitoring, and I guess we need to be confident and to assure ourselves, have we a robust medium and long-term financial plan in place? Are you happy for this to go forward? Just finally, Mark, I have to say, just echoing what others have said, you do put together readable reports. I'm always happy because you do seem to have a story behind the figures, because you've got a rounded knowledge of how everything comes together. And I think you're very diplomatic. I don't think you show any political bias. Right. We're on the straight now, can see the finishing line in sight of today's meeting. We are now going to go over to Hazel, and we're looking at the list of actions that was arising from the last meeting and see what's been done.
Chair, some of these relate to the last Adult Select Committee meeting and some also from the joint meeting of the CYP and Adult Select. So the first one, item 4, that is underway. We mentioned this briefly earlier, that Councillor Brown and Councillor Pratt are to work with Julie to look at the data security system, and they will report back to the committee. I'll build that into the work programme just so we don't forget about it. The next item, it was to item 5, to arrange a special meeting of the Adult Select Committee. We're going to come on to that in a second when we discuss the work programme, and that's to have a discussion with the Health Board. The next item was Supporting People programme grant. Those changes have been passed to the relevant officer to take forward, and one of the other issues that isn't listed there but is an action for the CYP Select Committee is that they would like to see that report reported to them, and we'll be taking that in September. Number 8, the private sector housing loan scheme. The sort of thoughts of the committee, the conclusions there were passed on to the officer, and obviously that's been incorporated into the report that's been taken forward. And then number 9, in terms of Council Cabinet Forward Work Programme, we noted last time the Crick Road business case, and we requested that that comes back to scrutiny before it goes to Cabinet, and I've chased the officer for that. As soon as we've got timescales, it's been confirmed it will come back here. And we're to remain focused on domiciliary care, turning the world upside down. And at the meeting that we're going to hold with the Health Board, we'll be discussing care closer to home, which links with this quite nicely. So would you like me to take you on to the work programme?
Please, Hazel.
Okay. The scrutiny work programme doesn't appear, Chair. Oh, yeah, it is on the agenda. It does appear to be there. Basically, the special meeting that we've discussed that we need to hold with the Health Board, it's been long awaited. We're going to open it up to all members. I think there's lots of people with interest there, and lots of people will want to ask questions. So we're going to need to have a pre-meeting, and I was going to ask you if you wanted to extend your half-an-hour pre-meeting slightly more to incorporate good planning and questioning. Mm-hmm. But I would think that really you need to be attending that meeting fully prepared with your questions. It's not regular and often that we can have the Chief Executive of the Health Board here to answer your queries. So specifically the items on the agenda are to discuss the plans for Chepstow and older adults mental health services, and then to discuss care closer to home. We have discussed in the past as a committee that, you know, obviously we've sort of scrutinised in advance the decision that was taken by the Health Board, and we are where we are, and I think the focus seems to be now on going forwards and ensuring that services in place are sort of fit for purpose. So we'd urge you to focus questions on a forward-looking basis, but I know that members will have some questions that they want to ask about where we are and how we've got to the stage we're at. There will be reports sent out, but I think they can't quite meet the agenda dispatch of 5 days, but they will be sent out as soon as they're available, hopefully the next day. There'll be a report from the Health Board, and also there'll be some input from us. So that is proposed on the 19th of July at 3 o'clock. So there's a select committee in the morning. That's quite a long meeting because it's got quite a large agenda. But I'm thinking what time realistically you would want to have a pre-meeting. is 2 too early, or do you want to make it 2:15?
Depends on those who are on economies development, I expect how much they...
Oh, that's true, actually.
This is on the 19th at 3 o'clock.
Mm.
Oh, economy development.
So you're going to miss pre-meeting. Paul, do you have a view? 2:15? So that would allow a short break for economy and select members and then straight back here. Is that okay? So if we send out...
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt about the time. It's just a question of, presumably, as in all council meetings, there will be a public forum section, will there?
Yes. It is a special meeting, and sometimes special meetings usually don't have a sort of public open forum. But I think by case basis, this is one where you really will want to do that. So yes, I think it's only right that you do. Do you want to stick with 15-minute public open forum? Yeah. And Richard is due to dispatch the agenda tomorrow, isn't it? So for you to note then, 3 o'clock, but we'll say a pre-meeting at 2:15 and invite all members. Okay. So that then will be your last meeting of the summer. I'm sure you're pleased to know that. And then myself and the chair will be meeting with some officers to kind of have a think about forward work programme items. But obviously you've got future agreed work programme items that we still haven't dealt with. And there's a really long list on the back page, which I don't intend to run through now, but they're kept there so that none of us forget about them.
Good.
Okay, Chair?
Yeah, happy with that. I think it is important when we're looking at the special meeting because it could be quite emotive and there's so many questions we want to ask the health board, but I think Hazel's right, if we can just keep focused on those two main areas. And when looking at Chepstow, she's right, if you like, the deal is done and we need to move forward, but some people may have questions around how that process went through. Any other questions? Well, you've all done very well. You've been here for 3 hours asking some challenging questions. And thank you for being kind to me on my first chairpersonship. Thank you.